Mr. Jaime Ongpin, who is...
That's lovely. She said that you're Mr.
I'm Jaime Ongpin from the Philippines, waiting to be interviewed by Moira.
Hey, that's lovely. Thank you very much, both
Okay,
of you.
ready?
Fine, yes.
Right, are we ready now?
Okay, we're ready.
Mr. Ongpin, what's your opinion on the findings of the Agrava report?
Well, I'm disappointed and disturbed by it, in particular by the fact that the chairperson, Justice Agrava, has chosen to come out with a minority opinion which conflicts with the opinion of the 4 other members of the investigating panel.
Why do you think that Corazon Agrava has stuck to a decision to issue the 2 verdicts rather than recognize the majority's vote? Is it because she doesn't want to see Fabian Ver indicted?
Well, it's very hard to say, exactly what her reasoning is. But, in the manner that she has conducted herself during the hearings in the past, many people have been somewhat disturbed by her attitude in terms of her ability, or perhaps more importantly, her inability to cope with the tremendous pressure that has been put on her and on the board. She has broken down in public a number of times, and in one particular occasion back in July when Mrs. Marcos was invited to appear as one of the witnesses. It happened to be on Mrs. Marcos's birthday, and Mrs. Agrava asked the panel of investigators and the audience to start off the proceedings by singing Happy Birthday, which many of us thought was totally inappropriate, and that created a great deal of unhappiness. And if you read into that sort of behavior, it seems to reflect an underlying sympathy on her part, no?
Yes. Do you think that the Marcos regime are putting pressure on her?
Well, I don't know. It's very hard to say, but whether or not the regime is putting pressure on her, the pressure is there. I mean, the whole nation is putting pressure on the panel, or has been putting a great deal of pressure on the panel to come out with a proper report and to come out with it in a timely fashion. And as you know, it's been delayed for many months.
Well, of course. And how do the businessmen react? Are they with Agrava, or would they want to go with the majority
Oh, it
vote?
seems to me clearly that not only the businessmen, but most people in the government who are not directly associated with the government, are clearly sympathetic with the opinion of the majority of 4, who have, I think, regardless of the pressure on them and the possible consequences to them personally, have gone all the way and accused, I believe, a total of 26 persons as being in one way or the other directly or indirectly involved with the conspiracy or with the attempt to cover up the conspiracy. Whereas Mrs. Agrava has only, in her report, indicted, I believe, 7 persons.
Really? And do these 26 people belong to the government at all?
Most of them belong to the military. There is one private individual who's a businessman, but who also has been associated with the military. Almost all the 26 people are part of the security arrangements.
I see. How do you think that government ministers in general will react to the verdict? Do you think that they'll put pressure on the Marcos government to publicly recognize that General Ver was the person who instigated the assassination?
Well, one has to distinguish between their public response and what perhaps might be their private response. I think that publicly they will have little choice but to manifest support for whatever position the president takes. I think it is very unlikely in the Philippine context that any of the ministers would publicly contradict the president's position on such a sensitive matter. But what they say to him privately, I'm sure would be quite another thing. And in fact, I am informed that a number of them, even prior to the release of the report, have already attempted to persuade the president, to act in a certain way.
I see. So, apparently President Marcos has recommended a speedy prosecution of all those named. What do you think this would involve? If the people who have been named so far, and including Ver, are found guilty, what do you think the sentence will be? Will the justice or the law of the land prevail over and above personal loyalties?
Only time will tell, of course, but based on the arrangements which have been announced up to now, I am very, very disturbed. To begin with, the venue for the proposed trial that has been selected is what is called the Sandigan Bayan or the Tanod Bayan, which is an ombudsman kind of office. And in the past, they have been notorious for not ever convicting anyone of importance. These courts have been used basically to harass petty grafters and some political enemies of the administration. And it would be a farce, if the most important crime in the history of the Philippines were submitted to this, whatever you call it, makeshift court for trial. I think that would be totally unacceptable to the Philippine public.
I see. And what exactly are you doing in London?
Oh, I'm here on business, on private business.
Oh, I see. But do you plan to organize the opposition groups who fled the Philippines when martial law was imposed?
No, I do not plan to do so, although we do keep in touch, from time to time with opposition groups, not only in the Philippines, but as well as abroad.
I see. If the leaders of the opposition groups abroad return to the Philippines, will they face, do you think, the same fate as Aquino?
Well, I think that under the circumstances, there is always a risk, but it would be highly unlikely. It would be the height of brazenness for anyone in the military at this stage to try to pull the same sort of thing, a second time.
Yes, they have learnt the lesson, perhaps. Do you think that Marcos has successfully survived the seeming threat to his rule through the elections and the commission report caused by the Aquino killing?
I suppose you can say that he has survived because he remains in office. But clearly, his authority, particularly his moral authority, has almost completely disintegrated, in my opinion. I don't think you can find too many Filipinos today, who respect Mr. Marcos's authority. He's still president of the country, but as far as his ability to lead, the nation and to inspire confidence is concerned, I believe most of that has disintegrated. Largely because of what happened in the Aquino assassination, in that affair and the aftermath of it.
Okay, if Marquinhos then is vulnerable now, how can opposition groups unify to exploit that vulnerability? Could they do it through strikes and demonstrations or through other means?
Well, it depends on what segment of the opposition you are referring to. The activists, who have been engaged in organizing many of the street demonstrations, clearly will continue to do the same thing. The opposition politicians who are in the legislature, who constitute a third of the votes as a result of the last elections in May, will use the legislative floor as their venue for the opposition. And many of us who are in business and who are professionals and even plain housewives are attempting to find a role, in all this change. And I think I speak for the vast majority of Filipinos when I say that 90% of those who live in the country today would opt for some sort of orderly transition from the present autocratic rule that we have under Mr. Marcos to a more democratic form of government.
Yes. And what can you do to convince the Reagan administration that opposition to Marcos strengthens democracy, not communism?
We will simply have to try to continue doing the same things we have been doing, which is articulating what, in our opinion, would be essential to restore genuine democracy in the Philippines. And at the very heart of that is an effort on the part of most of us to persuade everyone who is involved with the Philippine scene to create sufficient pressure on Mr. Marcos to compel him to give up his autocratic powers. You know, under our Constitution, under an amendment which he claims was passed in 1978, he has the power to legislate by decree, so that literally by the stroke of a pen, he has transferred vast resources from the government credit institutions to his friends, and the economy as a result is in shambles. As a businessman, this is of greatest concern to me, that sort of system be put to an end, because if you're familiar with what has happened to the Philippine economy, clearly the evidence is very overwhelming that this sort of system simply does not work, because it has demoralized the private sector totally, to a point where anyone in the Philippines with any substantial amount of capital, instead of investing that capital in the country, has decided to move it offshore. I hope only in the meantime, as long as this system prevails.
But the business community has been reasonably silent during the years of martial law. They haven't really criticized the Marcos regime. But this situation seems to have changed during the recent months.
Well,
is that true?
It is definitely true. I guess you could say that there were two stages, or three stages. The first stage was during the martial law years from 1972 through 1981, when martial law was lifted in name, but not in substance, many of us claim, because he continues to have these autocratic powers. During that period, you had little or no noise from anyone in business, simply because under the president's formal powers at that time, anyone who said a contrary word literally could be locked up in the cooler for an indefinite period, with no right to bail or anything else. And people were intimidated by that, particularly people in business. Now, in 1981, after martial law was formally lifted, although, as I said, we claim substantially it has not been lifted, there began I guess you began to see some evidence of a few individuals who began to speak out in public against certain things that were going on, and this was particularly precipitated by a financial crisis in January of 1981, during which the money market collapsed, and it became very evident that enormous amounts, really billions of pesos, of government credit resources had been misallocated to a small group of business associates of the president, who have been referred to as his cronies. There began, a wave of criticism against that. And then the third phase would have been directly after the Aquino assassination, when even people who, had previously been totally quiet, just were so, I guess, upset and traumatized by what happened that they began to speak out vocally and even participate in street demonstrations.
And do you think that Marcos listens to this criticism and takes note?
I know he does, because if you trace the sequence, of all of these demonstrations and opinions in the press and whatnot, he has had to compromise on a number of very important issues. Directly after the assassination, the greatest concern, because Marcos at that time was very ill, although he has never publicly admitted it, the greatest concern was over the succession, because under the old constitution, if something happened to the incumbent president, he would be succeeded by a 15-man executive committee. And many of us felt that would have been an impossible situation. And so there was great pressure to elect a vice president in the elections which were completed in May of this year. For a period of 2 or 3 months, Mr. Marcos stonewalled that issue. He said under no circumstances would he agree to change what was in the Constitution. But the pressure built up to a point where he could not resist it, and he had to call a plebiscite in January of 1984, during which the Constitution was amended, and in lieu of an executive committee, there is now a procedure whereby a president will be elected, a vice president will be elected in the 1987 presidential elections. And in the interim, if something happens to the incumbent president, the Speaker of the House would assume the powers of the President, and there would be an election which he would supervise within a period of, I believe it is 60 days.
How strong, Mr. Ongpin, do you think the opposition